creating this room in case David Sachs wants to come in and talk about remote work. People on Twitter seem to believe that we have a fundamental disagreement, but I am sorry to disappoint in advance, but I suspect we will agree on most things. Anyway, David, hope you can join us, and welcome.
Hey, Naval, happy to join you in this room and talk about remote work. My view is that a strategy of what I would call full remote doesn't work for most startups or big companies for that matter. And I would define full remote as 5 day a week, work from home or work from anywhere for 100% of the employees. That's not to say that there's not a subset of employees for whom remote work is great. And that's not to say that there are some companies, typically small companies, where the founders are directly managing everyone, where full remote 5 days a week can work. But I don't think that most companies can make 5 day a week full remote for 100% of the employees work. And there are several reasons for this. And the reasons are a little bit different for whether you're a big company or you're a small company. If you're a big company, the problem is just productivity. And this is why you're seeing companies like Meta and Amazon and many others telling their employees they should be back in the office 3 or 4 days a week, or they're going to limit remote work just to specified roles. Clearly, they're seeing a drop in productivity. I think for startups, the reason is a little bit different. I think that the problem really comes down to problem solving. I think that when everybody is atomized and working in a different location or working from home, you lose serendipity, you lose cross-pollination, you lose the ability for people to whiteboard problems together. You lose the ability for people from different functional areas to have lunch, to sit and eat together. And by the way, I think startups should cater lunch. I think it's money well spent. You lose the opportunity for product managers and salespeople and marketers to, to meet at lunch and share information. Every meeting, when you're fully remote, has to be scheduled. And that overhead creates a pretty big disincentive, I think, for employees to get together and, again, share information and cross-pollinate. Now, if everything's going great in your startup, then this maybe doesn't matter that much. But I think that when things are not going great, it is much harder to diagnose problems and course correct and fix problems. And really, I'm talking about companies startups that are more growth stages that have hundreds of employees. I think that when you're, a dozen or so employees at that seed stage where the founder can literally touch every employee, you probably can do it remotely. But when you get into hundreds of employees and teams are no longer sitting together and each employee is just working from their house and reports to a manager who lives somewhere different, who reports to a manager who lives somewhere different, and people are only interacting on scheduled meetings or maybe Slack, I just think you lose a lot. And, imagine if you're the founder of one of those companies, everything's gone great. You've raised a growth round of funding, and then all of a sudden you hit a rough patch and things aren't working, and you're starting to question the quality of your product market fit, or you're questioning the quality of your go-to-market fit. You've never had these problems before because everything was working great, but now all of a sudden you're not growing fast enough. How do you even begin to diagnose those problems? I mean, I know how I would do it when I was operating. I'd go walking around the office and try to meet with everyone and try to figure out from as many people as possible what was happening, what was going wrong. I think that's very hard to do when everybody is remote. Similarly, once you figured out what the new plan is, you're going to pivot. You want to get people aligned behind that plan. That's really hard to do as well when everyone is remote and not working together. So, look, I think that, can some companies make remote work? Sure. Do I think it's a mass market solution for most companies? For 100% of the roles 5 days a week? No, I don't. I think that companies are going to course correct back to what I would call clusters or hubs. I think that it's probably unrealistic to expect everyone to be in one office like the old days in one headquarters. But I think that companies will seek to cluster their employees in a few key hubs that allow them to come together for collaboration and also culture building. And I think it's going to be a lot easier for growth stage companies to manage their workforces that way. All right, I'll stop there and see what people's reactions to these thoughts are.
Hi, David. Thanks for joining us on this pleasant Saturday afternoon. Apologies for the delay responding, but that's the beauty of async. We can each talk whenever we want. I'm not sure we're going to have a debate so much as nuanced agreement, but that's okay. I don't really like debates anyway. I'd rather just learn. You have a lot more experience building large companies than I do. I tend to stick to small companies, and I will say a few things in favor of remote work for small companies in this day and age. Firstly, as you pointed out, small companies can be remote as long as they're built from the ground up to be remote from day one. They don't transition to remote later, and as long as the founders are in complete contact with the entire team. For large companies or for companies that started out in an office, I think it would be extremely difficult. You need to start with the kind of people that are self-managing and whose outputs are clearly traceable, and that tends to be engineers and salespeople. For fuzzier roles, it is much harder to ascertain who's doing their job well and who's not. It also helps if you have asynchronous tools like Slack and AirChat right here. Nevertheless, for creativity, for brainstorming, you need to be co-located at least occasionally or regularly, and I think that's where the big issues come in. The creative teams generally either have to be co-located or the creativity has to be assembled within one or two individuals who are together. The moment you start scaling or the moment you have roles whose output cannot be cleanly traced, then I think you have to go co-located, at least for those teams whose output is intermingled and where creativity or brainstorming is required. But let's not overlook the advantages of remote work. One is, if you're truly working async, then it's way less interruptive, way less people walking into your office and interrupting you, way less water cooler talk, way less having to conform to somebody else's schedule, way less having to drag yourself out for a meeting, and you can intermingle and interweave the other priorities in your life far more efficiently. I think of it as packet switching versus circuit switching. Packet switching networks are much more complicated. They require more intelligence. They're harder to build and maintain. Circuit switching is very efficient once you have the circuit nailed down. But for flexibility, packet switching is unbeatable, and the applications you can build on top of packet switching are far greater. So ultimately, I think new technologies are what change culture and what change behavior. So the new technologies of async communication will make packet switching much easier and will allow people to communicate and work together more efficiently. The other advantage is you can hire the best people wherever they are. So I can recruit the best engineers on the planet. I don't have to worry about a location. I can work 24/7 and weave it into my schedule. So it's not quite 24/7, but I'm crossing the street, I can work. I'm sitting in the back of a cab, I can work. I'm on a train, I can work. I have a little bit of downtime, I can work. However, if something else demands my complete attention in the moment, I can give it to that thing instead. And let's face it, in this day and age, jurisdictional flexibility is very important. Some places are much better homes for startups than others, and it depends on the kind of startup. Crypto companies, for example, are now doing themselves a disservice by being located in the United States. It's not even possible for them to be in mainland China, and so on and so forth. We are entering the age of the sovereign individual. The best people are going to be sovereign. If you want to work with the best people, you cannot lock them down to a single jurisdiction. But ultimately, I think you're correct. A Facebook or a Google that relies upon people to scale still somehow in some way, if they need a lot of headcount, then they're going to have to co-locate the creative parts of that headcount and the parts of the headcount where their outputs are intermingled and you cannot trace success to any given individual. The accountability is low for an individual, and so the team has to be held accountable. And for that, you often have to put teams in a single location. AirChat is built from the ground up to be fully remote. We're fully asynchronous. We do a small number of Zoom kind of check-ins, but that's about it. And even those are optional. And so we've built this team from the ground up. I've recruited engineers who I've never had a synchronous conversation with. But that requires that we only work with the best engineers on the planet, and we scale entirely through code and community. If we ever have to hire hundreds of people, God help us, because a company that's built remote from the ground up will have a really hard time landing and expanding. Anyway, I've rambled enough. Would love to hear more of your thoughts, and of course, we can always switch topics too. I can change the name of the room. This doesn't have to be just about remote work. I can change the name of the room. This doesn't have to be just about remote work. And if there are questions in the audience, if there are any really, really good ones, compelling ones, I will stitch them in.
Hey, David, that makes a ton of sense. I'll say from my own experience, I worked on Capitol Hill for 11 years and recently left to start my own communications company. And the Hill is the most sociable belly-to-belly business there is. And the one thing I miss most is the office. It's the people, it's the camaraderie, it's the relationships. The bonds that you form are lifelong. And so I love the flexibility that I have now to pick up my kids or take them to practice. But I'm really looking forward to getting back into an office in that social environment.
If there's one industry I would love to see go into remote work, it's the federal government, ironically. Why? Because right now it's concentrated too much in DC. So too much of a very large and very diverse country is run by the politics of whoever tends to live in Northern Virginia. And so their politics become the nation's politics. It would be better if, thanks to remote work, the federal government was actually distributed evenly, or at least according to population, within the federal borders. I'll also mention a few points about remote work, some of which are obvious, but some of which I think are less popular. Probably the single biggest consistent source of unhappiness in a worker's life is commuting. So if we can cut that down, that's pretty amazing. The biggest source of stress for people as they get older and raise children is being close to their extended families. Remote work helps with that too. But now on the flip side, if you're a remote worker, it's much easier for your employer to terminate you. There are less bonds that keep you in the company and less cultural damage from ripping you out of the fabric. Also, the people who are engaging in remote work are taking a big risk. They're now in global competition with everybody else. You're not just flung into competition out of the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, into the rest of the United States. You're in competition with every engineer in India or China or Thailand or Indonesia or wherever. There's also a degree of salary normalization that goes on. I was recruiting an engineer in India, and he asked for a $300,000 annual salary. It's not that unusual over there for the top people. There's less office politicking. There's less groupthink. There's less single-minded mentality around culture and what's acceptable and what's not. And if you're going to serve a global user base, it helps to have a global workforce, but one that is built without cultural fiefdoms, where every office feels like an outpost in a far-flung military empire plotting for itself against a center homeland. There's a specific experience that I have with running AirChat that's just magical that I've never encountered in any company before. I have a dozen rooms open with a dozen different engineers. I have separate team rooms open for big projects. I have rooms open with individual users and beta testers, and I'm literally just packet switching all the time, barking out everything from a demand or an order or a bug to a request or negotiating or pleading or brainstorming. And I can literally slide it in exactly at the optimal moment. When I feel like talking about a bug, I talk about that bug. When I feel like talking about potentially a motivation issue, I go lean on that. When I want to have a conversation with a user about how they're feeling or thinking, I can put it in there. When I have a thought about how to improve the product, I can route it to the right person immediately, even if they're offline, and know that they'll see it and respond when the time is right. So the efficiency of working on this company is literally 10x beyond anything I've ever experienced. We move at an insane velocity, shipping 10 or 15 bills in a test flight every day, and it's enabled entirely by async and remote work. There is no chance I would be as efficient in an office. Just the act of commuting to the office, leaving the office, having to detox from leaving the office, commuting home, being exhausted, then saying, this is my precious day off, and so on and so forth. Again, this only works in a company of less than 20 high output people, but when it does, it's sheer magic. I am doing this conversation from outside of a relative's house who went through a difficult surgery. She is asleep inside. The moment she's awake, I'll be back in there. Earlier, I was driving, so I didn't want to get on a phone call because of the noise. I don't have to schedule anything. I don't have to check my calendar. I haven't checked my calendar in days. If someone were to add something to my calendar, I would just miss it. My calendar does not exist. Instead, I'm available in every moment to respond to whatever that moment asks of me.
One thing I took away from David's super tweet on remote work was that he was in favor of making exceptions for super talented engineers and super talented salespeople who also just happen to be more remote anyway. I'd be curious to hear more from him on that, if there's anything more to say.
I totally agree that the centralized bureaucracy in Washington isn't working, and that the bureaucrats that work in these agencies aren't serving the interests of the American people across the country. I think that's more targeted towards the administrative agencies as opposed to the legislative branch. And there has, in fact, been pushes recently to move some of these executive agencies out of Washington, D.C.